Hi, welcome to anyone who may have come across this, and hello to my existing subscribers. Um, the events in the United States over the past 48 hours raise a lot of questions about which direction America's going in. Now, there's been a lot of whataboutery in terms of the violence that happened last year, ostensibly not getting the same media treatment, and I think that whataboutery is justified to an extent insofar as there are obvious double standards. But the charges of double standards are being going thick and fast both ways because uh, Trump critics, Democrats, left wing people, for kind of an umbrella term, um, and Joe Biden himself, I have to say, have really homed in on the fact that there was a bit of a lax response to this yesterday. Trump himself claimed he called in the National Guard. I think most people agree that that speech he made was scripted. But Biden said that he spoke to his daughter and she said that there wasn't the same sort of police, or there was a very different police response to Black Lives Matter demonstration that she had seen. Um, I think it's hard to ignore the fact that there does seem to be an optics issue there. Um, but it's overly simplistic because there were a lot of areas where, for example, that whole thing in Portland, in Oregon, and Seattle, where the police gave up is probably the wrong word, but where there was basically anarchy around Black Lives Matter and Antifa protests, and the police weren't homing in there. Um, if a bunch of black people had stormed the Capitol building, would it be a different response? Given America's history, I think, and even in the current climate, I think it's fair to say it probably would be on some level. Um, but I would also be very, very cautious about race baiting on this. For a start, the idea of white privilege, well, there was no white privilege for the woman who died. Now, I'm not saying that she was, completely innocent. She wasn't. She was part of a violent mob that stormed the Capitol, and they were violent. Many of them were brandishing firearms. Some of them could have been concealed carry. Some of them were armed with devices. Um, some of them came with sort of apparatus that could have been used for possible hostage taking. This was not a peaceful protest. Let's just get around that. It wasn't. And anyone who claims it was is their idea of peaceful is deluded. It wasn't a peaceful protest. Um, Now, I have heard the argument that it was focused on a political establishment as opposed to people's homes and businesses. That's true. Um, this wasn't just any old political establishment. It wasn't like some local government building, which would be bad enough. This was the heart of American government. I mean, this has not happened since we, the British, the burned down Washington under Robert Ross in 1814. Robert Ross was the British commander. I decided to check that out actually, just to look a bit into that. 1814, that's 207 years ago. Well, it will be there this year. So it is unprecedented, and of course it's newsworthy. Of course it's going to get a lot of attention. One of the people involved, I believe his name is Jake Angeli. I'll just double check that. The guy with the horns that drew attention to himself and kind of sat in the yeah, Jake Angeli, 32, from Arizona. Now, apparently, he is an outspoken QAnon activist, for want of a better term. I looked at one of his videos where he was interviewed, and it was just a flow of babble. That's the only way I could describe it. Whenever I start hearing people talk about the deep state and going down that line, I think I'm either saying or communicating with someone who is beyond the point of any reasoning. Because with hardcore Trump voters, supporters, and with conspiracy theorists, I mean at that level, I think QAnon is like pretty near the top of sheer off the scale lunacy, for want of a better term. I was trying to avoid using an offensive term, but honestly, I don't know any other way to say it. Um, so there's no reasoning with people like that because they're convinced that anyone who disagrees with, challenges, or doesn't see the world exactly as they do are all part of the plot. I mean, this guy thinks Donald Trump's a whistleblower. For what? The swamp? He's helped create a swamp. I mean, his administration is rotten. Um, I mean, I've been very critical of Trump. I'm also pretty critical of people who work for him for a long time and then suddenly find a conscience, just because of the events of yesterday. I do give Mike Pence credit for doing his job, but, he did accept to be so closely tied with Donald Trump. Now there's a backlash turning on Pence because he actually done his job. Um, oh, so now he's part of the deep state. Um, but anyway, I really think that America's in a very bad way right now because this is like a constant yo-yo situation, and it has been, I would argue, not just the last couple of years, but the last probably probably decade, if we're being honest. It's kind of been like there's been a bout of right-wing extremism, which then gets counter-condemned. Then there's left-wing extremism, which gets counter-condemned, and there's a blowback against that. It's just this constant um, pendulum. And I honestly think centrists and moderates must be utterly, utterly disillusioned. Now, Biden, I think, has been far more presidential insofar as he did clearly say that rioters should be prosecuted, regarding the events of last year. However, he is playing the identity politics game. He was playing up the whole if they'd been black thing. I think it's true to an extent, but it obviously doesn't apply to the woman who's killed. I mean, that in itself just flies in the face of that argument. Um, and it is irrefutable that the likes of CNN took a very, very different take on last summer's violence. They always put the caveat, oh, well, there's been unrest, but it's a minority of people and it's awful, but it's a minority. Now, I don't have much time for the mentality of Trump voters or supporters. I really don't. But, the people who stormed the Capitol building, there was probably a few hundred of them. 74 million people voted for Trump. So I think it is important to put that in context. I think there are potentially a lot of Timothy McVeighs out there. I think these people are extreme. I think they're capable of doing dangerous things. But left has been very, I mean, CNN, just the coverage is very predictable. They're, very, what's the word? Full of righteous anger and full of, oh, Trump should be prosecuted. Trump should, he's fueled this. And I agree with all that. But I'm thinking, well, when people talk about the different response to the violence last year, it might be what about rape. That doesn't mean that it's illegitimate because the double standards on both sides, and I think that you can find examples on both sides. Um, all it does is fuel anger. So when there's polarizing language like white privilege, what's that going to do? It's going to anger and polarize center right people, white people who voted for Trump. And they're not racist. They're really not. But they bitterly resent being seen in that way when that might not match the reality of their lives. Hell, I'm offended by the term, and I'm no Trump supporter. But it's an obnoxious, ignorant term. I mean, I know where it comes from, the idea that white people are treated differently. But what I really resent is the privilege part, white privilege, because privilege denotes undue perks. There's plenty of white poverty in America. Anyway, that sort of thing, all it does is, and when I see, bodies like Human Rights Watch, which in my opinion should know better, just normalizing it, they're fueling the flames. Then on the other hand, you have the deluded hardcore Trump supporters who their heads explode every time they hear something they don't like. It's all fake news. Like I said, there's no reasoning with these people. So summed up, if you condemned the violence last year, but you're trying to justify this, or if you are condemning this, i.e., the assault on the Capitol building, um, but you're okay with the violence last year, you're part of the problem. And it's hell, I'm an outsider and I'm frustrated by it because I think it's tragic to see what's happening to the United States. The world needs a stable America, at least the free world does. I do think, though, with everything that's going on, Americans in general maybe need to show a little humility. The whole thing about American exceptionalism and we're the best at everything. Well, no. America's the most powerful country in the world, but let's get over this arrogant idea that it's the only country that believes in freedom. It isn't. I mean, right now, I would argue American democracy is fragile. I would argue that American society is fragile. And it is here to an extent as well, but really, the optics over the last few days have been appalling. Um, but really, when I see senior CNN pundits like Jake Tapper and Don Lemon, you know, I agree with a lot of what they say, but I also think that they are guilty of selective outrage. I watch CNN often, so I'm not talking about rumors here. I'm talking about directly what I see. When the riots were going on last year, they covered it and they express how disillusioned people are and how angry people were. And they never directly condoned looting or violence, but they did downplay it. They did. And if a Trump supporter was to say that, they would immediately go, call them all the names under the sun. So I honestly see a situation where there's kind of two extremes, or rather, there's too many right wingers or too many Trump voters, because left and right is maybe too black and white. Too many Trump critics, who are just basically digging down deeper and not stopping for a second to think, well, are we absolutely right about everything? And it's in a way, to me, it's two extremes because you have the extreme conspiracy theories, and those sort of delusions from hardcore Trump voters, but you also have the extreme self-righteousness from the other side, who well, they're so much superior than the white supremacists and these knuckle-dragging Trump voters. Or we're so righteous. Let's virtue signal. Let's talk about white privilege. Let's polarize millions of people. Um, their utter failure to introspect is part of the problem. Cancel culture, woke intolerance, all that sort of thing, to me is just as ugly and just as much a threat to democracy as what happened in the Capitol building. I really believe that. And I detest what happened the other day. Or maybe a better term is I'm shocked by it. Um, But what I just urge American mothers to speak out, let your voice be heard. Don't let the extremes on both sides, whether it be the intolerance of woke dogma or the intolerance of conspiracy pushing Trump cultists. And I'm using quite blunt terms here. I'm being quite offensive. But why the hell not? I mean, if it's okay for the hard left and the hard right to be so dogged and so zealous, then why shouldn't centrists like myself be outspoken as well? We're living in extraordinary times here, and I'm very grateful to have this platform. I'll just say a quick word before I round this up on Zuckerberg's decision to suspend Trump's Twitter account. As one of my friends pointed out, he still has access to the nuclear codes, can't send a tweet. Well, this kind of relates to the previous video I made on free speech. Free speech has never been absolute, never, in any society. And with it comes responsibility. So if you're the president of the United States and you're telling lies and you're provoking insurrection and you're constantly doing that on a platform, you can't realistically demand that the platform doesn't take any action or that they simply allow you to do it with impunity. So, whilst I'm not settled in this, I I'm tempted to think it was the right decision because the idea that Trump could just act with impunity, say whatever he wants with no responsibility, with the influence that he has on his supporters, that's an abuse of free expression. And actually, as Facebook is not the government, they're not in a position to, well, I was going to say, to be arbiters of free speech. They do that. One of the foundation stones was about freedom of expression, but I think basically it comes with responsibility. They've done this because they argue, and I agree with a lot of the points Zuckerberg made, that Trump has abused that platform. The only thing with Facebook, though, and Twitter is that, well, in the case of Facebook, again, lack of consistency. There are Islamist groups on Facebook, been flagged, they've been reported, and they still stay up. So there's double standards there. But I really, really think everyone needs to look at themselves and think, am I consistent in my values here? Am I holding my own side to account as much as the other side? Because that's a problem. These hardcore Trump voters, I mean, they're now saying, oh, well, the people that got into the Capitol building, they were really anti-fat in disguise. They just will not accept that their side could be capable of that. And on the left, I remember I was disgusted by those who were saying, trying to downplay looting, destroying people's lives. Literally. They were saying things like, oh, well, we don't support it, but it's not as bad as someone being shot, referring to George Floyd. But the looting is not a small thing. It's not. Looting someone's business, burning someone out of their homes, to me, that is a very serious crime and should be treated with the utter repugnance it deserves. And when I saw left wingers trying to downplay that, I was utterly disgusted. Anyway, I'll round this up, but I just think that centrists, moderates, and even reasonable people on the left and the right just need to take responsibility here. Now, Biden has been a lot more presidential than Trump, but I am a bit concerned about some of his pandering to identity politics. I imagine that's for the BLM wing of the party, the progressives that helped him get into power, but that will polarize a lot of people, and Biden needs to know that.